How are you guys doing tonight? My name is Kevin. I'm an adventure photographer, and today I'm going to talk about how not to do astrophotography. Astrophotography is one of those things that's really learned through trial and error. Even when you already know what to do, while you're at the location, you're going to be doing a lot of testing settings and then chimping or checking your photo after you take each picture to see what you need to change to make it better, especially considering when it's pitch black out, you can't even see the framing of your shot most of the time. So you're going to have to check the photos over and over and over until you get the framing right, and then you can start diving into the settings a little bit more. I'm going to show you about 3 or 4 pictures I took, two about a month ago in Africa. We were in Lesotho, me and my brother. We were climbing into the mountains. That country is actually made up of pretty much all mountains. And we got stuck up there in the middle of the night, and it turned out to be the most beautiful star location on Earth pretty much that I've ever seen. There's no moon. There wasn't a city for like 200 miles, so there was no light pollution. And it was just pitch black, and you could see every star in the sky. And the Milky Way was super obvious, just like almost fake it looked in real life. So in astrophotography, it's gonna be a battle between 3 things. It's gonna be a battle between the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. There's no perfect setting for any given scenario, so your goal is going to be to try and find a good balance between them. I know everyone's at different levels when it comes to camera settings, so I'm going to go over them real quick and how they play into astrophotography specifically. All right, the first thing you're going to want to do is decide upon the aperture. Now, this is going to be a pretty easy choice because if your camera only goes down to f4, you pretty much have to use f4 at least. If your camera goes wider than f4, like f2.8 or maybe even wider. But if your lens goes to 2.8, it's going to be a choice between 2.8 and then to 4 for the most part. You definitely don't want to go any more narrow than f4 because you're just not going to get enough light onto the sensor, and it's not really going to work when you're outside in pitch black. The nice thing about f4 is that more stuff will be a little bit more in focus, whereas if you're down to 2.8, you can kind of only choose if you want the stars in focus or if you want the foreground in focus. You can't really have either. Now, if the picture is kind of small and compressed, everything kind of looks in focus more or less. But once you start zooming in, and if you're focused on the stars, you'll see that the foreground is pretty blurry, especially if it's close to the camera. If you're at 4, the foreground will get a little bit less blurry and a little bit sharper all around the image. Now, in a perfect world, I would set the aperture to f8 just so I could get everything in really good focus. But when you do that, you're going to have to raise the ISO so high and lower the shutter speed so much that it's just going to create a ton of problems for the image overall. So it's not really something you can do when it comes to astrophotography. So pretty much a good rule of thumb is just to open the aperture as wide as it can go. Okay, for these 2 pictures in Africa, I did not have a tripod, so that is one of the things not to do. Don't take astrophotography without a tripod. It's going to be much more difficult to get a non-blurry image. In this picture here, here's my brother climbing up a cliff ladder thing in the middle of the mountains in Lesotho. It looks like I missed the focus on the stars by a little bit. Even though I missed that, the foreground is still quite blurry when you zoom in. If you're zoomed out, it's pretty okay, but you can definitely notice that it's at f2.8 overall. And then in this second picture here, I did actually nail the focus on the stars pretty well, which means that the foreground and my brother are even less in focus. Given that it's at 2.8, they are a bit blurry, but this one has the advantage where the subject in the photo is further away from the lens, so they will appear to be a bit sharper. It would be a scenario like this where I might try to dabble with f4 or maybe even f5 if I had a tripod, just to try to get the whole foreground and background a little bit more focused or a little bit sharper. But since I didn't bring a tripod up this mountain, what I ended up having to do was set my camera on some rocks and hold it ever so still at a perfect angle while I took the pictures. And I even held my breath kind of like a sniper.
Beautiful.
So, and I managed to pull it off kind of, but I do think they would definitely be better if you had a tripod. All right, the next thing to keep in mind when doing astrophotography is shutter speed. So the shutter speed you're gonna wanna keep as long as possible when you're out in the dark. You're gonna have the shutter open for entire seconds rather than fractions of seconds like you normally would in a daylight environment. And then a good rule of thumb for this is the longer you can keep your shutter open, the better, because it means you can reduce your ISO and draw in more light with less noise. But keeping the shutter speed too long also introduces more problems, which I'll show you in these pictures here. One problem is that you're gonna find that the stars start to streak across the sky if you go too many seconds with the shutter speed open. As the Earth rotates, the stars are gonna start to appear to move across the sky, and they're gonna streak through the frame of your shot. If your shutter speed is longer than like 3 to 5 seconds, it's gonna be obvious in the pictures and it's gonna show up in the pictures. If you're trying to make star trails, this is what you're aiming for, but if you're not, if you're trying to get pinpoint stars, you can't have the shutter speed open that long. Probably longer than 3 to 5 seconds, you're gonna start to get streaks. And this is why if you buy a high-end telescope or you go to like a scientific research facility with giant telescopes, they have motors that actually move the telescope at the same speed that the Earth rotates so that the stars are always in the shot. Probably a bigger problem than the star streaking is wind, or if your camera is set up on an unstable base. Wind is a huge problem. If your camera moves at all, it basically kind of ruins the picture. That's why it's so hard to do handheld or like hand prop up astrophotography. It's pretty much impossible. This is just kind of a garbage photo that I took out in Utah. If you zoomed out, it looks okay, but once you zoom in, you can see that these stars have like these crazy squibbly lines on them, and that is from the wind. There's so much wind there on that cliff thing that I was literally like hunched over, guarding my camera from the wind as the shutter was open, as it was taking pictures, but even that wasn't enough. The camera jostling around just a tiny bit. So if the camera jostles around just a tiny bit, it kind of totally screws up the stars. And then in this picture right here, you can kind of see a combination of the star trails starting to form, as well as the wind blowing and making them a little bit squiggly there. And then obviously if your ground isn't stable, you're gonna have the same problems. And the other issue with a long shutter speed is that if you have any subjects or plants in your photo in the foreground there, they're definitely probably going to appear to be blurry, especially if it's windy. These objects are going to move, the leaves are going to blow, the grass is going to sway in the wind. When your shutter's open for 5 seconds, it's going to just appear to be blurry and kind of ghost-like. All right, the final thing you have to keep in mind when doing astrophotography is the ISO. So the ISO is just how powerful is the sensor functioning, how much light is it sucking in. So for ISO theory, and this goes for all pictures, you're gonna want the ISO as low as possible for any given scenario and only boost it up when you have to. So for astrophotography, you would want it at 100 at the bottom, but that's not gonna be enough light for what you need to do, so then you're gonna have to increase it from there. I probably wouldn't go past 5,000. I definitely wouldn't go past 6,400. This is going to depend on what type of sensor or camera you have. Pretty much any camera, you're not going to want to go past 6,400 because there's just going to be too much noise, especially in a dark photo with lots of blacks. It's going to be really easy to see the noise in there. So you're going to have to take some test shots and just figure out how much ISO is acceptable to you. And here's an example of 5,000 ISO, 3 seconds shutter speed, and f2.8. So I can't open the aperture any wider. Even if I could, I probably wouldn't, because like I said, I want to keep this stuff in somewhat focus. The shutter speed I had to keep low at 3 seconds. I probably would have gone up to 4 or 5 seconds, but because I didn't have a tripod, I could not keep the camera stable. So anything more than 3 seconds, pretty much the whole thing was just blurry and ruined and unusable. So I had to keep it low at 3 seconds, which meant that I had to increase the ISO up to my personal theorized limit of 5,000. And it looks okay when you're zoomed out. When you're zoomed in to the black areas, you definitely see obviously a ton of noise. I think zoomed out it looks all right though. But like I said, if I would have had a tripod, I would have reduced the ISO to reduce the noise, and to compensate, I would have decreased the shutter speed and kept the shutter open longer. And then another thing you're going to want to watch out for is light pollution. This isn't really something that you can control in any way. If you're at a location and there's light pollution, there's nothing you can do about it, obviously. If you're gonna do astrophotography, probably go somewhere that's really far away from cities. Out in those photos in Utah, there's a city pretty nearby, so it kind of bleached out the sky and it didn't really look that great. And the other thing I was gonna point out is that the higher in altitude you are, the clearer the sky is gonna be, because there's less atmosphere, there's less moisture and stuff like that. So you're gonna be able to see the stars better. And then for astrophotography, you're gonna probably wanna focus on the stars. To do that, I usually just do autofocus, and the 2 cameras that I've had have been able to do it, though I've had cameras in the past that definitely couldn't do it, and then in that case, you're gonna wanna manually focus on the stars. You won't probably be able to see in the viewfinder that well if it is focused or not. So take a couple practice pictures while you're trying to do focus, check them on the back of the screen, see if they are in focus, and then once you're sure it's in focus, then don't touch the focus, and then take your pictures from there. All right, guys, I don't know if you learned anything. Hopefully you did. Hopefully you like my Novembeard. If you want to become an adventure photographer, follow me on Instagram and follow me on YouTube, and I'll make some more videos just like this one to help you guys out. Until next time, see you later.